Clearwater's first black police chief stands strong after being assaulted, proving that courage and leadership can change everything. How did she do it in the face of racist white officers? Let's follow this story together. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any exciting stories. Now, let's get started. In the small town of Clearwater, nestled in the southern United States, change was on the horizon, though it came quietly, almost unnoticed by those who thought they knew everything about their community. Sarah Carter, a woman of strength and resilience, walked through the doors of the local police station, but not in the way one might expect. She wasn't wearing a uniform, no badge glinting on her chest to announce her arrival. Instead, she wore simple jeans and a blouse, blending in like any other citizen. But Sarah was not just anyone. She was the newly appointed police chief, the first black woman to hold that position in Clearwater's history. With over 2 decades of experience in law enforcement, she had worked her way up the ranks, not because of favors or quotas, but because of her undeniable skills, her sharp mind, and her ability to navigate the complex world of policing. Sarah had seen the darker sides of the system. She had been overlooked, underestimated, and sometimes even ridiculed, simply because of the color of her skin and the gender she was born into. But she never let that stop her. She knew the world would change, but she also knew that change had to come from within. So, on her first day in the position she had earned, Sarah decided to make a quiet entrance, observing the very system she was about to lead. She walked into the station, not to announce her authority, but to see how her future colleagues would treat her, a black woman in their midst. Little did they know, she wasn't just another face in the crowd. Sarah Carter was the new chief, and she was about to transform Clearwater's police department forever. As Sarah stood quietly in the lobby of the Clearwater Police Department, she observed the disarray that greeted her. The officers at the reception desk seemed more interested in their casual chatter than in serving the community. A black man, his face worn with the burden of worry, sat in a corner, waiting. His posture, stiff with anxiety, spoke volumes about the lack of respect he was receiving from the officers who were meant to protect and serve. Not one of them had approached him, offered assistance, or even acknowledged his presence. The air was thick with indifference, and Sarah could feel it settle around her like a heavy fog. She took a slow breath, keeping her composure as she made her way toward the reception desk. A young officer, no older than his mid-20s, was sitting behind the desk, his eyes fixed firmly on his phone, clearly oblivious to the world around him. He looked up only when Sarah cleared her throat softly, a polite but firm gesture meant to catch his attention. His eyes skimmed over her briefly, sizing her up, but he said nothing. Instead, he offered her a half-hearted smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "What do you need?" he asked, his tone flat, unwelcoming. Sarah held his gaze for a moment, steady and unflinching, refusing to be intimidated by his dismissive attitude. "I'm here to see HR," she replied, her voice calm but assertive, making sure her words carried the weight of her request. The young officer looked at her again, his expression blank for a moment, before his eyes flicked back down to his phone. Without so much as a word, he resumed scrolling. Sarah could feel her frustration simmering beneath the surface, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she stood there waiting, observing the way this officer, and by extension, the department, treated the people they were supposed to serve. The man in the corner, still waiting, was met with the same cold silence, his patience wearing thin with each passing moment. Sarah had witnessed this sort of neglect in her years on the force, but seeing it so blatantly here, in her own department, was a painful reminder of how deep-rooted the issues were. Just then, Sarah heard a voice, deep and heavy with authority, cutting through the silence like a knife. "What is this?" The voice belonged to Lieutenant Thomas Miller, a man Sarah had heard of but had yet to meet. He was known for his long tenure on the force, a relic of a time when things were handled with more force than empathy. Sarah turned to face him, meeting his gaze with a calm that belied the tension in the air. Miller was tall and broad, his presence commanding the room. His eyes, sharp and critical, took in Sarah with an almost dismissive glance. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Sarah didn't flinch. She wasn't here to argue. She was here to observe, to make them see her, to understand that she would no longer be invisible, not in this department, not in this town. "I need to see HR to complete some paperwork," she replied, her voice unwavering. But Miller was quick to dismiss her. With a raised eyebrow, he shot back, "Procedures? Are you sure you're in the right place?" The sarcasm in his voice was palpable, and his eyes reflected a judgment that Sarah had long since learned to ignore. Still, she stood firm, refusing to allow his words to shake her resolve. "Yes, I'm sure," she said calmly. "This is the Clearwater Police Department, right?" Her question hung in the air, challenging him to dispute her claim. Miller let out a sharp laugh, more out of irritation than amusement. He clearly wasn't accustomed to being questioned, especially not by someone like her. "I don't think HR has time to deal with cases like yours," he said with a sneer, clearly indicating that her presence here, in his eyes, was nothing more than a nuisance. Sarah's blood began to boil, but she kept her cool. She knew better than to lose control in a moment like this. Instead, she calmly repeated her request. "I need to see HR." But Miller wasn't done with his subtle jabs. He turned to the young officer behind the desk, who still seemed more interested in his phone than anything else. "Do you hear anything?" Miller asked, his voice laced with mockery. The officer shrugged, barely acknowledging the situation. "She wants to see HR," he said, as if it was the most insignificant request. Miller chuckled, then glanced back at Sarah, his tone dripping with scorn. "Well, I don't know if HR is even interested in dealing with your kind of problems," he said, the words hanging in the air like a slap to the face. Sarah felt the sting of his words, but she did not let them break her. She didn't flinch, didn't let the anger bubble to the surface. Instead, she stood her ground, her voice steady and resolute as she spoke again. "I just want to get my paperwork done." The words were simple, but they carried a weight of meaning. She wasn't asking for special treatment. She wasn't asking for anything more than what every citizen had a right to. But Miller, it seemed, wasn't interested in offering her even that small courtesy. Miller's dismissive attitude only deepened the tension in the room, and Sarah could feel the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. She had dealt with ignorance and prejudice throughout her career, but it always stung when it came from someone in a position of power, someone who should know better. As she stood there unwavering, her gaze locked with Miller's, she could feel the old officer sizing her up, not with respect, but with contempt. "Listen," Miller said, crossing his arms over his chest, his voice sharp and condescending. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, but this is a police station, not a social club. We don't have time for whatever it is you're here for." His words were pointed, meant to belittle her, to push her back into a box she had long since outgrown. Sarah held her ground, refusing to let his words penetrate her armor. She had worked too hard, fought too long to be treated like this. "I'm here for the same reason as anyone else," she said, her voice steady but firm. "To do my job." Miller's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a tight sneer. "Your job?" he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What job is that? Are you here to monitor us? To lecture us on how we should do our jobs? I think you've got the wrong idea about how things work around here." The other officers in the room, who had been watching the interaction from a distance, began to shift uncomfortably, but none of them intervened. It was as if they were waiting for Sarah to back down, to show some sign of weakness. But Sarah didn't flinch. She was used to this. She had spent her career breaking down walls, earning respect from those who thought she couldn't. "I don't need to lecture anyone," she said, her voice calm but with an edge of authority. "I just want to get my paperwork done and move forward with my responsibilities." Miller wasn't satisfied. He took a step closer, his imposing figure looming over her. "Well, maybe you should know your place," he said, his voice low, threatening. Sarah felt a flash of anger rise within her, but she quelled it, holding on to her composure. She knew this wasn't about her. This was about the system. "I do know my place," she replied quietly, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce determination. "And I'll make sure you do too." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment there was an uncomfortable silence. Miller's face twisted in disbelief, as if he couldn't fathom a black woman, especially one in her position, standing up to him like this. "You think you can just waltz in here and take over?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "I'm not taking over," Sarah responded calmly. "I'm here to lead, and whether you like it or not, you will show respect for that." Miller stood there for a moment, his eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and confusion. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this. It was clear he was struggling to comprehend how a woman, especially one of her race and background, could have the audacity to challenge him. But Sarah wasn't concerned with his confusion. She was focused on the bigger picture. She had a job to do, and if Miller didn't understand that yet, she would make sure he did soon enough. As the silence stretched on, Sarah's presence in the room began to shift the dynamics. The other officers, who had once stood by idly, were now starting to take notice. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with discomfort, but none dared to speak up. The tension was thick, but Sarah stood resolute, not backing down, not allowing the weight of Miller's disdain to break her. She was here for a reason, and she wasn't going to let anyone forget it. The situation, once tense, now simmered on the edge of violence. Sarah could feel the temperature in the room rise as Miller's frustration grew. His face flushed with a mixture of anger and disbelief that someone, especially someone like her, dared to challenge him. It was clear to her now that this wasn't just about paperwork or protocol, it was about power. He needed to assert his dominance, to remind her, and everyone else, that he was the one in control here. Miller took a step closer, his large frame towering over her, his fists clenched at his sides. His voice dropped low, almost menacing. "You think you can just walk in here? Act like you belong and make demands?" he said, his breath hot against her face. The air around them seemed to crackle with the tension of the moment, and Sarah's heart beat a little faster, but she stood her ground, refusing to let his aggression intimidate her. "I'm not making demands, Lieutenant," she replied evenly, her voice calm but unwavering. "I'm asserting my right to be here, just like anyone else." Miller's lips curled into a mocking smile, the kind that spoke volumes about his deep-seated disdain. "Rights? You don't have any rights here, not with people like me in charge," he sneered. He was daring her to back down, to submit to the role he had assigned her in his mind. But Sarah wasn't about to let him control this moment. She locked eyes with him, her gaze steady and unyielding. "I have every right to be here, just like anyone else," she said quietly, but with the weight of conviction. The words seemed to hang in the air, cutting through his bravado. Miller's eyes narrowed, and without warning, he raised his hand, his fingers curling into a fist. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized what he was about to do. The room seemed to slow down in that instant, the noise of the world fading into the background as she braced herself. And then, in a flash of anger and arrogance, Miller's fist flew forward, striking her hard across the face. The force of the blow sent her stumbling back, her body colliding with the edge of a nearby desk. She teetered for a moment, struggling to regain her balance, but she didn't fall. Instead, she stood there, stunned but not broken. A sharp pain spread across her cheek, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her in pain. The room went eerily silent, the laughter of the officers dying away. Some of them, the younger ones, shifted uncomfortably, while others stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Miller, his chest heaving with anger, stood there staring at her, as though he expected her to crumble. But Sarah did not cry out. She did not fall to the floor. Instead, she slowly straightened, her hands braced against the desk as she pushed herself back to her feet. Her cheek burned where Miller's fist had landed, but her eyes burned brighter, filled with a quiet fury. The silence in the room stretched on, thick with disbelief. Sarah's gaze never wavered from Miller's as she lifted her head, her posture as dignified as ever. "Is this how you think you can intimidate me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pain. "Is this what you think will break me?" The officers around her exchanged nervous glances, but no one moved. Some looked at her with admiration, others with fear, but no one dared to interfere. Miller, meanwhile, stood frozen, his own expression caught somewhere between confusion and anger. He had expected her to cower, to retreat, but instead, she had stood taller, more resolute than ever. The balance of power in the room had shifted, and for the first time, it was clear who was in control. Sarah's silence in the face of his violence spoke volumes. She wasn't just here to fight for her place. She was here to change the very system that had allowed men like Miller to thrive unchecked for so long. And though the room was still tense with the aftermath of the punch, Sarah knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. As Sarah stood there, her hand pressed gently to her cheek where Miller's punch had landed, the room seemed to hold its breath. The silence was thick, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The officers, once laughing and mocking her, were now unnervingly quiet. Some shifted awkwardly, unable to meet her gaze, while others seemed frozen, caught between their allegiance to Miller and the stark reality of what they had just witnessed. Miller, too, seemed momentarily disoriented, his hands still clenched into fists at his sides, his chest rising and falling with the anger that still burned inside him. He had struck her, something he hadn't expected her to endure without breaking, but Sarah remained as composed as ever. Her posture was still upright, her eyes clear and sharp, betraying no sign of weakness. She had taken his blow, but she had not been defeated. Just as the room lingered in that painful silence, the HR department door suddenly opened. Sarah's eyes turned toward the figure who emerged, and she immediately recognized him. It was Harold Mitchell, the HR manager, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a deep sense of responsibility. His eyes scanned the room quickly, landing first on Sarah and then locking onto the scene that had unfolded before him. The shock was immediate, and his face drained of color as he realized what had happened. His gaze flickered between Sarah and the now unsettled officers, his voice breaking through the tension with the sharpness of realization. "She's the new chief," he said, his words almost too loud in the quiet room. "What the hell did you all do?" The impact of Harold's words hit everyone like a thunderclap, the realization of Sarah's true identity causing a wave of panic to ripple through the room. Miller's face froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had been so confident, so sure that his position was secure, that he didn't even consider the woman in front of him might be the one in charge. His arrogance had blinded him to the fact that she wasn't just any woman. She was the new police chief, the one who held the power to make sure he faced the consequences of his actions. As Sarah stood silently, watching the chaos unfold, the officers who had previously snickered and supported Miller's behavior now began to look around in fear. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, their faces paling as the magnitude of their mistake dawned on them. Others avoided her gaze, their guilt written clearly on their faces. But no one spoke up. No one dared to challenge the truth of what Harold had just revealed. Sarah's calm, unyielding presence was the only thing that remained certain in the room. Miller, for the first time since this confrontation had begun, appeared uncertain. His bravado had crumbled, replaced by panic. He turned to Sarah, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. "No, no, this can't be," he stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of his own shame. But Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't move an inch. "You didn't know who I was," she said quietly, her voice low but filled with authority. "But now you do." There was no anger in her words, no bitterness, just the steady, unwavering tone of someone who knew their worth and had nothing to prove. The officers around her shifted nervously, some whispering to each other, others simply standing still, knowing the moment had passed when they could ignore the truth. Sarah's identity had been revealed, and with it, the full weight of her authority had descended upon the room. Miller's arrogance was now exposed, and the realization that he had just assaulted the person in charge of him left him stumbling for words. But Sarah was beyond caring for his excuses. She had been patient, and she had endured, but now it was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. The room had changed in an instant, and the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Sarah Carter was in charge, and nothing, not even Miller's rage or the ingrained systems of prejudice, could take that away from her. The realization of who Sarah really was hit the room with the force of a wrecking ball, and the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. Lieutenant Miller, once so full of confidence, now stood there, frozen, as if the ground beneath him had suddenly crumbled away. His face twisted in disbelief, his eyes darting from Sarah to the HR manager, Harold, who had made the revelation. He stammered, his words tripping over each other. No, this can't be." His voice faltered as he grasped for any semblance of control, but the damage had already been done. The truth had been exposed, and there was no turning back. The officers who had laughed earlier, the ones who had watched in silence as Miller struck Sarah, now shifted uneasily, their faces pale, their expressions laced with guilt. Some avoided her gaze, but none dared to speak. The atmosphere had changed, thickened with tension, and the weight of Sarah's silent authority hung heavy in the air. Sarah, standing tall despite the pain that still lingered on her cheek, looked at Miller with steady eyes, her voice cool but filled with unyielding strength. "You don't get to do this," she said softly, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. "You don't get to treat me this way because of who I am, or because of what you think I am." Miller flinched at her words, his body language betraying the fear and panic that were now bubbling up inside him. For the first time, he was the one on the defensive. Sarah was in control now, and he was powerless. Without waiting for him to respond, Sarah turned to the officers who had been watching this scene unfold. Her eyes swept over them, and for a moment she held their gaze, letting them feel the weight of what was at stake here. "What happened here today is unacceptable," she said, her voice quiet but commanding. "Miller will be held accountable for his actions, and so will anyone else who thinks it's acceptable to treat people this way." She paused, letting her words sink in, and then she turned back to Miller, who was still standing there, looking as if he had been struck dumb. "Lieutenant Richard Miller," she said, her voice firm, "you are under arrest for assaulting a civilian in this building. You will be escorted out of here by 2 officers, and you will face the consequences of your actions." The room was still, silent, as if everyone was holding their breath. Miller, for a fleeting moment, seemed to recover his composure. His chest puffed up with defiance, his face contorting with anger as he spat out words that were meant to defend himself. "This is ridiculous," he hissed, his voice rising. "I didn't know who she was. This is a setup, a political conspiracy." But Sarah didn't flinch. She simply stood there, watching him as he floundered. "It doesn't matter who I am, Miller," she said calmly. "What matters is what you did, and you're going to pay for it." 2 officers, hesitant at first but no longer able to deny the truth, stepped forward. They approached Miller, their hands reaching for him as he struggled to break free. "Let go of me!" he shouted, but his resistance was futile. The officers grabbed his arms and twisted them behind his back, securing handcuffs around his wrists. The sound of the cuffs snapping shut echoed through the room, a clear and final statement of his downfall. The once mighty lieutenant was now at the mercy of the law he had spent years serving, but had so thoroughly corrupted with his hatred and arrogance. As the officers began to escort him out, Miller's eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for someone to come to his aid. But the silence from his colleagues was deafening. Not a single officer moved to intervene. Not a single voice rose in his defense. They all knew that what had happened today was unforgivable. They all knew that this was the moment when everything changed. As Miller was led out of the building, the weight of his disgrace following him like a shadow, Sarah stood still, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. The room was still heavy with the aftermath of the confrontation, but the shift in power was undeniable. Sarah had stood her ground, and she had won. There was no going back for Miller, no escape from the consequences of his actions. For Sarah, this was not just a victory. It was a reminder that even in the face of violence, even in the face of prejudice, justice would always prevail. And for the first time in a long while, the air in the room felt a little bit lighter. It wasn't just about the arrest. It was about the change that was now possible, the change Sarah was bringing to this department, to this town. The fight had only just begun, and Sarah was ready to lead them into a new era. As the doors slammed shut behind Miller, the atmosphere in the police station shifted once more, this time to something quieter, more somber. Sarah stood in the middle of the room, her presence commanding attention even without a word. The officers, who had witnessed the entire scene unfold, now shifted uncomfortably, their gazes avoiding hers. Some of them were visibly shaken, others still processing what had happened, but none dared to meet her eyes. Sarah's quiet confidence had not only taken down Miller, but had also exposed the weaknesses within the department, the system that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked for far too long. It was clear now that the culture of complacency, of tolerating injustice, was no longer going to be allowed to fester. Sarah knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The officers who had laughed at her, who had silently supported Miller's actions, would not suddenly become her allies. They would resist. They would resent the changes she was about to bring. But she was ready for that fight. She had spent her career breaking down barriers, proving herself in a world that was often hostile to her. And this moment, this victory over Miller, was just the beginning. She didn't need their approval. What mattered was that she had the power to lead, and she would use that power to change things from the inside out. "This department will not tolerate this behavior anymore." Sarah's voice cut through the silence, calm but firm. "I will not allow anyone to think they can act with impunity, no matter their rank." Her words were simple but strong, carrying the weight of the responsibility that had just shifted onto her shoulders. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for Miller, but for the entire department. The officers who had once been complicit in the old ways now had to confront their own actions, their own biases. Sarah knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but she was ready. She was ready to lead them into a new era, where justice and respect would be the foundation of their work, and where no one, especially not a black woman, would ever have to prove their worth again.